The larches kept a green stillness that made the iron look louder than it was. Late summer air slid off the limestone and pressed a clean smell of dust and sap into my helmet foam. I stood at the base plate where the first ladder leaned into the pale wall and laid my hands on routine, harness snug, twin-arm lanyards traced and untwisted, field camera woken and set to the work preset. Inspection tags from the last pass tucked in my chest pocket like small permissions. Torquey wrench sleeved and clipped behind my right hip because it likes to catch on everything if I let it roam. I called into our regional channel and told the dispatcher I'd be on the Via Ferrata, that horseshoes above the timberline and returns to the meadow. A normal loop, weather quiet, no companions. The reply broke and came back whole, as if it had paused to listen to itself before speaking. The first rung was not even at head height, and still I took my time, because that is how I have taught myself to keep the day boring. I leaned my shoulder against the rock, looked up along the cable, and let the pattern settle in my head. Clip, check gate, check secondary, wait, move. The latter rungs were squared steel, the kind that find a way to pinch. I tested the first anchor plate not for heroics, but for story. My torque wrench has a light touch when I keep it gentle, and I only look for gossip, not proof. The plate answered without drama, the way an old friend answers the door when you knock with your glove knuckles. I signed the first inspection tag with the stub pencil tied to my harness, date code and initials, and a note about the recent thaw. The tag's paper had the slick feel of something that has learned to drink fog and carry on. I clipped my lanyard to the cable, felt the gate fall shut, and there it was. A low breath through metal, a sound small enough to ignore, but too deliberate to be an accident. The clip sang, not a whistle, not a scrape, a tone like a humid string. It held for a moment longer than seemed available in the air, and then faded into the wall. I waited to see if a gust had pressed a reed somewhere in the hardware. The trees below were steady. The fabric flag at the trail junction down in the meadow hung like a quiet tongue. I shifted weight, and the tone returned, a shade higher, as if my harness had learned to play. I told the camera what I was hearing because audio notes have saved me from my own memory more times than any logbook. The microphone picked up the click of the gate, and then that breath through metal again. And over the top of it, the faintest hiss of my own voice doubled half a beat later, the radio hanging on my shoulder catching and releasing my words even though I had not keyed it. The echo might have been a cable glitch from the repeater or some polite mischief in my earpiece connection. It trickled along my neck like cold sweat, and then it was gone. I wrote it down in the book as a delayed response on the net, noted to bring it up with the tech next time he came north with his case of parts and his bottomless thermos. Work is a list when it goes well. I climbed the first ladder. I pressed each rung with my boot, not to judge it, but to tell my body where its edges are. The sun warmed the side of my helmet and made the foam smell like an old workshop. When I reached the first stance, I tested the bolt at shoulder height with that same not quite torque, just to check for drift. The wrench gave me a short, contented click that felt right beneath the glove. I took photographs of the wall scars where water had left its faint handwriting, and of the anchor plate where someone with clean hands had wiped it recently. The inspection tag tied there wore a resin sleeve that had yellowed to the color of tea. The print inside showed last season's initials and a month code that my brain read one way, and then, when I shifted my feet, another. I told myself the glare was playing games. Light bends truth on pale rock. Every officer learns that. Past the ladder, the line traversed into a groove that cups wind in one direction and spits it back in another. Limestone has a way of talking without moving. I eased into the first run of cable, the lanyards running ahead of me like obedient dogs reaching for the next clip. Each time the steel kissed steel, the tone rose and fell, a careful scale up the wall. It followed my pace but did not exactly match it, as if it had its own preferred rhythm. I tried to shake the sound down to a simple explanation. The carabiners were clean, and the bushing in each gate felt smooth. The cable sleeve at the anchors did not show the fretting I associate with wild wind. Maybe the ladder itself was a reed in some long instrument built accidentally by rock and iron and summer air. Maybe the line had been tuned by the season. I stopped at the second stance to tag the anchor and take a wider frame with the camera. The glass flattened the valley into a map. The last larch line marked the forest edge with the stubborn green that endures after the grass yellows. Beyond that, talus and pale faces and the bite of shadow where the route disappears behind a buttress. I breathed through my nose, and it gave me the dusty sweetness of a trail used by straw hats and damp dogs. The radio creaked. I did not touch it. It spoke my last word back to me, trimmed of context, as if someone had cut it out with a small knife and held it up. I logged that too, and I knew it would read as harmless on paper. Things echo in the mountains. Sound takes the long way home. My mandate from the office was simple: check tags, note path hazards, do not touch critical hardware beyond light inspection, do not attempt field repairs alone. Anything more than that, and I was to call the maintenance crew who carry their own gospel of torque and paste and measured patience. The moral problem with simple mandates is that they feel generous until you meet a thing that deserves more attention. A small drift, only a hand's width, had crept behind one of the anchor plates, where seep had carried fine sediment over a season and settled it like powder. It will not bother anyone for a while. It will bother someone, someday. I took a photo with the angle held true, and I moved on. Choices cost something, whether you keep them or not. The traverse pinched to a place where the wall shrugged me out over a smear of old flowstone. This is the moment when habit and fear trade glances. I leaned into the rock, let the lanyards tug and then slack, and counted breaths without numbers until the counting became quiet. Clip, check, wait, move. The tone came again, softer now, across my left ear. My right-hand gate added a tiny harmonic, the way a bottle sings when your lip is not quite on the edge. The two notes were not an interval I could name, and that felt wrong because I am not completely tone blind, and because my sister played violin in a way that still has a say over the small bones in my ear. I told the wall that I heard it. It gave me shade in return. I reached a small platform where the path turns up toward a band of rooted pines that have somehow learned to live inside stone. A wooden footbridge spanned a crack here, an old addition, the kind that brings the agency into conversations with trail cooperatives and the hut manager who brings soup out to the threshold when the day is cold. I knelt and put the torque wrench on the bracket that ties the bridge to its bolts. Wood talks differently than steel when you ask it a question. It gives you a low knock through the wrist. The bracket felt as if someone had been here before me and asked the same polite question. The fastener eased a fraction and then felt like it remembered the right place to rest. In the resin pooled at the edge of the bracket, I saw a thread of larch needles stuck, as if pinned on purpose. That would be wind or a boot or a bird that landed where I wouldn't. Still, the way it lay pointed uproot, as though it wanted to be read. I filled the inspection tag with the same neat print, because if the day goes wrong, the paper is how the future will judge. Under remarks I wrote, tone present in clips, likely resonance. Echo on radio, probably repeater delay. Minor sediment behind plate near the traverse, monitor next pass. On the next line, without quite knowing why, I wrote a word I would not usually use on a form. Listened. It looked odd on paper, and then it looked like the only honest thing I could write. The wind slid through the gap between the pines and the rock, as if apologizing for being late. My lanyard gates rested against the cable. Without weight, they made no sound. Then the left one twitched against the sleeve, not quite a movement, more a thought. A brief rise in tone brushed the inside of my ear. I pretended not to hear it so I could listen better. The valley threw back a long, muted clatter from a hut kitchen, pots aligning themselves for the late afternoon. I had time to take the loop as planned and be down before the long pink strobes the walls do when the day gives up. I checked my watch out of habit and then did not look at the numbers because they make me hurry. I told the dispatcher I was continuing along the route and would check in again when I reached the shoulder above the first pine band. The radio cleared its throat with a tiny carrier hiss. I waited for my name and heard only my breath. On the move again, I kept my boots precise and my hands patient. The clips did their work without complaint. Still, when metal touched metal, the sound returned, a gentle ladder of notes stepping up the wall. I tried to outrun it, and it stayed with me. I slowed, and it waited. The cable knew my pace. That is how I wrote it in the book, even though I knew I would cross it out later and replace it with the kind of sentence that sits well in an incident database. Orders keep us honest. Field reality keeps us alive. When the root bent into shade, the rock cooled through my gloves, and the smell of sap went sharp, as if the trees were closing their windows. I paused before a longer traverse where the cable ran past a polished belly of stone that has made many people reconsider their day. I set the camera on my chest so it could watch what my hands did without thinking. I rested a palm on the anchor plate and felt a faint quiver that did not belong to wind or my own blood. I have leaned on anchors in storms and felt them pass the world through their bones without bragging. This was quieter, more like a cat asking if you are awake. I told myself I was building a list: ladder, plates, tags, bridge, radio, tone. I told myself the list would make a shape in the next hour that I could carry back to the office and lay on the table where maps and mugs leave their own circles. The first anomaly belongs to the day, not to me. My job was to notice without naming. I clipped in for the long traverse and let the lanyards take their small weight. The clip gates settled, the cable breathed, the notes waited for my step. I breathed with them and moved. The shoulder above the fin band felt like a kneecap under thin skin, all bone and a little grit. I set my back to the wall and let my breath settle until the thrum left my hands. The valley stretched itself, giving me the long view I use to appraise weather and the shorter view I use to appraise myself. The line ahead snaked across a pale apron, then into a darker slot where dolomite folds on itself and pretends to be gentle. I keyed the radio and logged my position without numbers, just sensible landmarks. Above the first trees, below the notch, entering the shaded span. In the return, I heard my own phrasing come back slightly tidied, the way a careful clerk repeats your words when they are writing them on a form. I told the clerk voice I was continuing, and the speaker gave me a soft carrier breath that sounded too much like relief. I started along the apron. The cable here was new enough to shine where hands could reach, and old enough to carry a memory where they could not. My lanyards ran with me, gates nipping the steel and falling shut with the same small finality as a drawer at night. At the first anchor past the shoulder, I paused and marked the inspection tag. The resin sleeve had gathered dust in a crescent that suggested wind from the meadow, though the air around me held still like a held note. Under remarks I wrote, "Tone continues." Then I listened. Without weight, without any clear motion, the left gate sang a faint vowel. I shifted a breath's worth of pressure, and the right gate answered with a shorter consonant. The pair felt less like sound than the memory of sound. I recorded, holding my breath to keep the microphone honest. It isn't music, I told myself. It is friction and flex. The metal is telling me about itself the way a hinge talks when it wants oil. Still, the little vowels and consonants formed a trail of notes as I moved from one anchor to the next, like cairns you cannot point to after you pass them. I found myself placing feet to make a pattern. Weight the left, wait the right, listen. If I hurried, the letter shapes in my head turned to static. If I slowed, the shapes returned as if pleased. I kept that to myself and to the book, because anything that depends on pace can turn embarrassing when sun and sweat change the experiment. Before the darker slot, a low ledge offered a small kindness. I crouched and took a wide frame with the camera, then a closer one of the cable sleeve where it bent around the anchor. The rubber showed fine scuffing, nothing to write home about, and a nibbled ridge as if a small stone had chewed at it in some storm and then lost interest. I set the torque wrench gently on the plate. The handle gave a little chatter, not through the bolt, but along the rock, a shiver that felt like a sigh that had changed its mind. I tightened nothing. The rule against field repairs is not just policy, it is humility. This route exists because a chain of choices were made and tested by people I can trust when I cannot see them. The slot took me in with cool breath. Pine pitch sharpened somehow without the trees being any closer. Shade pressed at the edges of my helmet where the liner has frayed into a soft halo. The cable here had a habit of brushing the rock in a way that leaves a graphite line, and the line had thickened since the last pass, just enough to say hello. I brushed gloved fingers across it, and my glove came away with a memory of black, not a stain, more like a whisper against the weave. I photographed the smear, then photographed my glove held in the same light so the future would know I had looked. Halfway through the slot, the path narrowed, and someone's boot had shed a thin sole chip that lay with its edge propped against the rock. The edge pointed uphill as if following an arrow I could not see. I placed it back where it had been, because it is not my job to tidy out here, only to keep people from learning the wrong lessons. My radio murmured then, a bare syllable that felt like my own name without consonants. I waited for the repeater to finish its joke. The silence afterward was clean enough to drink. On the exit of the slot, the cable rose past a rib in the wall that always reminds me of a staircase too small for use. Each rung of that fossil staircase was strapped with its own plate and tag. The topmost tag had slipped its knot and hung at an angle, still trapped by the cable sleeve. It could have been a boot, a curious glove, a bird. I pushed it upright, and the resin winked at me with a bubble trapped off center. I wrote down that it needed a new tie and gave myself a quiet promise to remember to bring spare cord next time, even though we are meant to leave that to the crew. Moral pressure is silly until it isn't. Beyond the rib, the root steps out across an exposure that makes even practiced hands speak politely. I took 3 slow moves and stopped where the wall offers a pocket not much wider than a helmet. The clips laid against the cable in a small embrace, and the tone returned, richer now against the hollow. It deepened when I pressed in, feathered when I backed off, and drifted a little when I turned my head. The field camera sat high on my chest and watched me listen. I spoke a line into the log for future me, tone changes with position, probable cavity resonance. Then, because the habit helps me think, I asked a question out loud to the iron. The answer was a pause that felt full, followed by a breath of sound that matched the shape of my question's rising end. I told the book to stop it. I crossed out told. I wrote noted. The afternoon found its color, and there was still a fair stretch to the shoulder, where the root begins to feel friendly again. I considered turning back to test the notes in the other direction. Pattern is loyal when you run it both ways. Otherwise, it is just attention-making tricks. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt the slight tug of the lanyards change with a rhythm I could not tie to wind or my own pulse. It was not the small swing that comes with standing in a place where human bodies become pendulums. It was a clustered sequence, pauses and breaths that felt like someone practicing patience on a distant side of the cable. I moved on, slower than the plan, faster than the part of me that wanted to wait. The bridge bracket on this half of the loop belonged to a different carpenter. The grain spoke a dialect that said alpine hut railings and ski racks. I tested it the same way and received a polite thud. No chatter in the wrench this time, no resin bubble winking. But caught in the crease between bracket and wall was a small shred of the same inspection tag paper, clipped at a corner in a way that looked too neat for weather. I picked it out and trapped it in the log with a strip of transparent tape. It felt fussy. It also felt right. Someone had read the tags and not just the scenery. When the wall gave me a wider stance, I took water from the bottle that has known my hand long enough to pass for a tool. The taste came with a metallic echo. I blamed on my teeth and then on the cap. Down in the meadow, a dog barked without urgency. In the hut yard, a pot banged with the authority of soup. The notes on the cable went shy for a stretch, as if the instrument had been put away to avoid a crowd. I told the camera I missed them. The radio clicked. It gave me back the word missed with the S's dropped. I stood there with my mouth open like a tourist, and then I laughed into the chest foam and made a note to cut that from the audio if this ever becomes part of a training talk. The final approach to the shoulder runs beneath a pale shield of rock that spalls in thin plates when winter breathes on it wrong. I picked my way under the arc with more care than usual, testing each rung with my boot as if the day had a right to judge me. At the second anchor, I felt the same fine quiver through my palm as earlier, but this time it came in paired beats, a pulse and a reply. The gap between them matched the time it takes to say my family name in a quiet room. I told myself to stop it again. I wrote in the log, paired vibration observed, likely thermal release in the wall. I underlined likely, and then erased the line because underlining does nothing for truth. From the shoulder, I could have descended into the meadow, through the long talus gully the locals use when the cable is rhymed. The light had begun its slide toward that warm hour when the pines make lace out of shadow, and the loop ahead would keep me high for another while. I called the dispatcher and said I was continuing per plan. The voice that answered was not the clerk voice now. It was my own, split by a lag and stitched together, speaking a clipped version of my check-in. The tail of the transmission held a thin metallic vowel, the same note my left gate prefers. I waited for a clarification that did not come. I told the book, comms behavior continues. Suspect repeater reflection, monitor. I started across the upper traverse with the sense that the list I had been building had begun to write me back. The clip gates brushed steel and shaped air into sounds that seemed to know my pace, and the anchors gave me the gentle arguments that old work gives to younger hands. I kept the rules. I kept my breath tidy. I let the notes lead me along the wall, as if they were markers left by a thoughtful stranger who had no patience for arrows and preferred the language of small, precise sound. When I reached the next stance, I looked down at the last tag I had signed. The ink had blued as if shadow had moved across it without the rock moving with it. I raised the pencil to write a line about light and trickery. The lanyard at my left hip twitched and hummed once, a syllable full enough to be the start of a name. The stance where the ink had turned strange was a shallow dimple in the wall, just enough room for toes and a promise of rest. I shaded the tag with my palm to cancel tricks, and the blue tint eased back toward ordinary, as if my hand had ushered it home. I said out loud that light plays jokes on paperwork, and then I stored the tag behind its sleeve, as if I were tucking in a child who had been caught telling one. The lanyards lay against the cable, like patient animals. The left gate made the shortest breath, the kind that barely registers until silence has already told you it was there. I felt the day trying to divide itself, a column of routine and a column of not quite. When that happens, I stack the tools. Torque wrench to the rear loop. Camera checked and set to capture a still every few heartbeats, even when I forget. Pencil sharpened with a thumbnail. I told the radio I was continuing on the traverse above the pale shield, approaching the open bowl that faces the hut ridge. The voice that came back matched my cadence with a half lag, and then dropped a syllable like a coin under a floorboard. I repeated my message, slower, as if I were teaching myself to speak to a classroom of distracted metal. The open bowl took wind even when the trees in the valley barely bothered to move. Today it carried a scent like cold tea and the dry sweet of pulverized rock. The cable rose over a swell of limestone and then dipped into a shallow saddle where runnels had cut thin ribs. Each rib bore the faint polish of boot rubber and the occasional scar where a crampon had written a small, angrier line. I placed my feet with the care you use when you are a guest on someone else's floor. As I crossed the saddle, the notes in the clips braided themselves into a little phrase, rising and falling with an intent I could not assign to physics without stretching the truth. I whispered that it was nothing but air and weight and old iron. The phrase repeated, a touch sharper, like a student correcting a teacher. On the other side of the bowl, a cluster of anchors sat close together where the root turns back on itself. This section has a way of making spatial sense wobble. Every season I have to remind my head that the wall comes forward and the ground steps back, not the other way round. I clipped into the first anchor and put a gloved hand on the plate. The pulse came again in that paired pattern, a call and an almost answer. This time I felt a thin tick between the beats, as if the wall had swallowed a watch decades ago and found it inconvenient ever since. I wrote paired vibration with interposed tick. No visible source. I took a close photograph of the contact between plate and rock. In the image preview, a stray hair lay along the plate edge, pale against the steel, and then, as I looked, that hair became a scratch in the glass protector, and then, as I blinked, nothing at all. I turned the camera off and on, not because it would help, but because it spoils a superstition to ignore it. The turnback led into a recess like the inside of a folded elbow. Here the rock keeps its own weather. The air cooled and brought with it a smell like damp linen. I knew there was no linen anywhere near me, only pines and stone and yeast and my own skin. The cable had been sleeved more generously in this recess, a newer section grafted to older rings, and the clamps showed tool marks that had their own careful rhythm. I held the torque wrench to one clamp to feel for a story. The handle gave a faint, regular tremor that did not belong to my breath. When I eased the wrench away, the tremor persisted in my fingers for a handful of heartbeats and then bled out into the gloves as if embarrassed to be caught. A smear of black ran along the underside of the sleeve where it kissed the wall. I touched it and came away with a shade on the glove that was neither rubber nor graphite nor sap. It had the clean smell of nothing at all and a texture like the fine grit you get when a map has been folded too many times. I dabbed a corner of logbook paper against it and pressed the bit under tape. My neatness looked foolish on that cliff, but it felt like a promise to my later self that I had not imagined it. The recess opened onto a short bridge made of 2 wooden planks, bolted to a little steel saddle. The planks wore the small scars of crampon points and the long, smooth arcs that come from cautious people with tired legs. I stepped onto the first plank and paused to let my weight settle the whole system. The clips did their hush talk. The plank gave a whisper along the grain, not a complaint, more a remark to itself. I bent to inspect the saddle. Between the saddle and the plank lay a coil of thread the length of a fingernail, the exact pale of the resin sleeve cords we use for tags. It could have been cut by a knife, or it could have been freed by weather and time. I set it in the book and wrote, "Thread fragment at bridge, watch for tag replacements next pass." The moral pressure of small things grew a little tooth. Across the bridge, the route bent left along a face that always gathers a thin veil of seep by late summer. It was dry today in the polite way of stone that promises to be generous later. A wasp cruised past my visor and then pivoted and cruised the other way as if I had been misfiled. The cable notes had gone backward leaning now, each contact giving me a tone that seemed to arrive a breath before the touch. Anticipation is just pattern recognition playing in front of itself, I told the air. The air did not bother to answer. At the next stance, a nest of inspection tags shared a single bolt like a bouquet. I thumbed through them in order, checking the handwriting, the dates by code, the remarks. The oldest tag at the bottom had a crease that made a little mountain range across the signature box. The newest tag bore an initial set I knew from the maintenance crew, a neat hand that rarely wastes ink. Between them sat a tag with handwriting that looked like mine but was not. The flourished tail on the second letter of my family name was missing, replaced with a tidy block. The remark line read, Kon Cham Ion Go OD. I parsed it as a smear, a tag that had bled under weather. Then I felt the chill along the back of my arms that comes when the obvious answer moves to the far seat. I checked my pockets to make sure the spare tags I carry for reference were still there. They were. I photographed that middle tag without commentary and tucked it back where I found it. I keyed the radio and gave an update heavy with ordinary, stable hardware, minor scuffing at sleeves, paper artifacts noted, no immediate hazards to the public. The reply came with my own voice trimmed and then sewn into a shape that said all clear in a tone I do not use. The carrier hiss afterward trailed into a long, faint vowel that matched the clip notes perfectly. I wrote, Comms vowel matches cable tone, likely shared cavity effect along route. The sentence looked sane. It also looked like a lie you tell yourself so you can keep moving. The wall narrowed and then eased, offering a view across to the hut ridge where someone had strung laundry between two posts. Shirts moved like slow flags. Far below, the meadow held its calm. The first dog had given up barking. A second voice, smaller, tried the job and lost interest midway through. Clouds had begun to collect around the far towers in the lazy, staged way that warns of later weather without promising it. My helmet foam tickled my forehead with the faint itch that comes when salt dries. I breathed through my mouth to taste the air. Nothing unusual. The unusual was all in the metal and the paper and my own head. I reached a longer ladder sunk into a weakness in the face, the rungs driven deep and flared where they meet the rock. My boots found the cadence they like, and the ladder hummed with the clips in a complicated little conversation. At the third rung from the top, no digits, just the rung that felt like midway, the tone stepped away from itself and landed on a pitch my teeth felt before my ears did. I stayed there, balanced between up and down, and let the sound draw a contour around my head. In the lanyards I felt that same paired pulse from before, a call and an almost answer, and this time the tick between them was wider, as if the wall had learned a new second language and was trying it on. Above the ladder, the route crossed a pale cornice of Dolomite where wind has a habit of inventing its own instructions. I moved with even feet and quieter hands than I give to most days. The camera on my chest caught the world with the impartial stare I rely on when my senses feel too eager. I spoke a line for later. Testing hypothesis of route-wide resonance will vary pace and clip timing. I changed my rhythm deliberately, slow, then quick, then slow, and the notes followed only when I settled back into my natural stride. When I forced a staccato, the tones went dull and ordinary, the way a stream loses song when you shovel more water through it than it wants. When I relaxed, the phrase returned, as if the route permitted conversation only when you acted like yourself. I stopped at a small foredeck of rock just before a crenellated buttress. Here, the wind wrapped around a corner and made a curious pocket, warmer than the rest, with a smell like cut wood. I checked the nearest anchor and felt a minute warmth where the plate met the wall. That could be thermal storage from the sun, or it could be a trick of glove and imagination. I held my palm there until the warmth sank to neutral. In the quiet pocket, the left gate gave a syllable that matched the sound my name makes when my sister calls it from another room. I told the metal that I heard it. The right gate answered with a brief denial. I let the answer settle, and I moved on. On the far side of the buttress, the world opened to a hanging meadow that the locals call the shelf, a place where bees find late flowers and goats polish their horns against stunted trunks. The route here angles gently toward that shelf before it veers away at the last moment, denying relief in favor of a cleaner line. I followed the iron to that near promise and drew level with a lone pine that had grown sideways for a life, and then decided to stand up for the rest of it. On its bark hung a fray of red thread that did not belong to any plant on this wall. I took it gently and tucked it into the book with the patience of someone folding a small map. I told the log, foreign fiber at Lone Pine, possible tag cord, possible clothing. I did not write the next possibility, the one that set my tongue to a sudden metal taste. I could have dropped to the shelf and cut toward the talus gully. It would have shortened the day and fed the portion of my mind that wanted to sort the notes in easier air. The plan, however, kept the loop high to the next shoulder before granting any dissent. I told the plan I would honor it. The radio made a soft, approving breath, a sound with no words that still managed to feel like a word. I clipped into the next span, and the clips answered with a pair of tones that came wrapped around each other. Not harmony, not dissonance. Something like two lines of handwriting crossing on the same paper. I let them carry me forward, exactly as trained, exactly as warned. The traverse after the shelf carries a kind of hush that even goats respect. The wall here holds back a ledge only as wide as a good boot, and the cable runs with a deliberate slack that makes you mind where you put your faith. I clipped in and told myself the same old prayer in the same plain words. Follow the iron, trust the sequence, know the wall. The left gate settled, the right found its place, and the two sang a brief reply that matched neither wind nor my own rhythm. I felt the helmet foam warm against my temples as the sun crooked its angle and threw a long, lean shadow of me across the pale face. That shadow folded over the cable, and my silhouette did not quite meet itself. The head arrived a breath after the torso. The arms caught up later, as if the wall were taking a slow inventory. I blinked, and it stitched together. I told the book, minor shadow offset on traverse, likely glare geometry. Writing it down did not make it truer. It made it easier to carry. The root rolled over a shallow rib and put me above a gray runnel that marks the start of the longer exposure. Beneath my boots, the limestone had the faint polish of 1,000 careful decisions. I worked the list. Gate check, weight test, move. At the next anchor, I set my palm and found that same paired vibration with the little waiting room between beats. The gap took the exact measure of a quiet name spoken across a kitchen. The plate held a warmth that could have been stored light or the flush of my own skin. I lifted my hand, and the warmth clung for an instant longer than it should. I set the torque wrench gently, not to turn, only to listen. The handle gave a whisper up the bone of my thumb, a suggestion that something beyond muscle and tool had a say in the exchange. I stepped back. Humility is a policy that does not require codification. The wall writes it better than we do. Across the exposure, the cable brushed a series of small ledges where seep lines leave thin black veins. I brushed one of those veins and found on my glove the same fine grit that is neither rubber nor graphite. It had no smell, and that absence felt like its own announcement. I taped a grain into the book. The tape crinkled in a way that made the radio wake and sigh. The speaker let out a shape like my breath, and then offered a clipped half of a word that could have been my name refusing itself. I waited for a full transmission that did not arrive. The silence afterward made the clips breathe in sympathy, a pair of shallow syllables seeking the next anchor. The traverse pinched into a corner where the wall throws shade even in long light. The temperature shift set a light ache in the knuckles, the old weather report my hands deliver when the day bends. In that shade, the clips lost their shine and became small, honest tools again. Their notes also lost the thin echo and deepened into something closer to a voice clearing itself. I rested my chest against the rock so the camera could see what my hands saw. The lens made rectangle truth out of a space that had never agreed to be rectangular. Along the cable sleeve, pressed neat into dust, lay an imprint the size of my thumb that showed the crimped pattern of a carabiner gate spring. It could have been from any climber who paused here and leaned on the hardware in a way the signs ask people not to. The placement was too exact for a shrug. It sat where a person would place a small pressure if they were listening to something inside the wall. I recorded my position by landmarks and told the dispatcher I was entering the shaded traverse beneath the notch. The voice that returned offered a faithful mirror of my phrasing and then trimmed the tail, leaving my last word half-made. Another voice leaned behind it, not separate, not layered, more like a reflection off a window that becomes a second face for an instant when light finds it. I asked for a repeat, and the channel went prim as a clerk. I wrote, "Interference unclear, will defer until ridge." Beyond the corner, the wall offered a narrow layback that has taught many people about leg trust. I slid through it with the practiced patience that keeps knees unremarkable. On the far side stood a pair of anchors closer than usual, a redundancy added after the winter of the heavy freeze. The nearer plate carried the fresh shine of new hardware, the farther one had the calm matte of a veteran. Their tags shared the bolt between them in a tangle that had been tucked as neatly as possible by someone who cares about tidy in a place that does not. I thumbed through the tags and found another line of handwriting that looked like mine in a bad dream. The same altered slope on the family name, the same clipped discipline on the letters, the same tone in the remark that refused to be remark. On this one, the ink had feathered along the fibers into tiny capillaries that made the words look like they were being absorbed. I photographed it twice and did not listen to the voice in my head that asked me to take it along. The rule against removing artifacts is not written down only for visitors. Stepping off that stance into the longer span, I caught sight of my shadow moving along the wall below me like a fish beneath a boat, each time the ledge widened. It lagged by a sliver again, and then snapped to, an effect that any cinematographer could explain by ray angles and surface texture. What I could not explain was the faint pitch change that accompanied the snap, a little vowel upshift in the left gate, a little denial in the right. The pair together made the beginning of a question. I answered in my ordinary tone for the audio log that will live on some server after I hand in the book. Continuing per plan, no hazards to public, anomalies noted and monitored. The carrier hiss extended, lengthening into the smallest melody until I moved again and gave it something else to mimic. A breeze walked carefully along the wall, carrying a hint of hot stone and the far-off broth from the hut, so thin it could have been memory. From below came a single goat bell, then nothing. Then the smallest clack of horn against wood. I thought about descending into the talus gully and returning later with another pair of ears. The loop ahead would keep me in these notes and this not wind for longer than my patience likes. The plan said continue. The paper in my pocket said listen. I chose the plan because choices have to tally with more than feeling. The clips rewarded me with a short consonant like a gate closing on a thought. The next bridge did not look like a bridge unless you have spent too much time on routes that were built by people who respect balance more than beauty. 2 narrow planks, a cupped saddle, bolts seated with care. I bounced just enough to let the system announce itself. The wood sighed in a different dialect than the last bridge, and in that sigh I heard something I had not noticed before. The wood voice and the cable note overlapped for a breath and made a third tone that neither owned. I set the torque wrench on the saddle and felt 100 small stories in the grain of the handle. Winter heave, spring swelling, tired hands. The wrench quivered very slightly with the cable, then stilled. Against the inner face of the saddle, tucked where nobody would see it without bending, a sliver of tag paper had been slid with care. It was not trapped by accident. It had been placed beneath the bracket lip the way a person slides a note under a door. I could see only the corner. I did not pry it out. I told the book it existed. The moral pressure of small things grew a second tooth beside the first. Leaving the bridge, the traverse runs under a pale brow of rock that throws a cool shadow in high sun, and a warmer shadow later. As I passed beneath, my own shadow climbed over me on the wall, and for a breath I watched myself move from above. My helmet looked like a small dark nest. My shoulders moved with more caution than I felt. In that instant, the left gate sang low, and the right gave a sharp reply, and their 2 notes together sketched the outline of a word I refused to write. I reminded the wall of policy in a tone meant for both of us. The wall held its tongue. The field camera had been chewing frames at the slow interval I had set back at the first ladder. I thumbed it into review and flicked through images of cable and glove and pale Dolomite. In one frame from earlier in the shade, my own outline leaned closer to the plate than I remember leaning. The difference could have been the small pause between thinking and acting that cameras are notorious for exploiting. It could have been the softness of glove edge and angle. The next frame returned me to myself. I toggled out of review and thanked the camera for keeping me honest, even when it feels like a liar by trade. Ahead, the route gathered itself for the corner I think of as the listening post. There, the cable runs past a fissure that drinks wind and gives it back as tone. It was the natural place to test the whole day's hypothesis about resonance and gaits and the way a pace can write a phrase. I told the radio I would pause there for a longer observation. The dispatcher gave me a simple acknowledgement and a reminder that night comes earlier on drunk walls. The echo of my own voice arrived half a breath later to repeat the reminder in a tone that was not mine. I nodded to both of us. At the listening post, I set my shoulders into the cradle the rock offers, and I let the clips hang without weight. Nothing sang. I took weight and placed it slowly, heel to toe, hand to cable, and the notes returned. the sequence now so familiar that my body carried it without instruction. I changed the spacing of moves, and the phrase broke. I returned to my natural cadence, and the phrase came back like a teaching that requires faith only in the self you carry. I spoke my family name in a flat field tone, and the cable gave me 2 syllables that did not match the letters but matched the shape. I said aloud that I would make no more of this than it deserved. I believed me for a breath. The light thinned. The ridge pines began their lacework. I could still make the next shoulder before the color turned to metal. I closed the book on the most recent entry and slid the pencil under the elastic. The last thing I saw before I moved on was my shadow standing still on the wall while my body reached for the next hold. It caught up an instant later with the smallest audible click from the left gate, the click of a tag being signed in a hand that looks like mine when the day has been too long. Sign-off is a ritual more than a mark. It has a smell, the dry odor of paper and glove, and a sound, the scratch of pencil caught in helmet foam or the slight click of a pen cap when someone forgets that plastic does not belong on this cliff. On the approach to the next shoulder, with the pines knitting evening into the rock, I felt the quiet pull of that ritual. A loop like this, done in fair weather with tame wind, usually ends with an easy set of lines. Hardware sound, tags in order, road open. I told myself, not yet. I also told the part of me that loves a finished form that it would have to wait its turn. The traverse narrowed to a place where the wall breathes around your ribs, and the cable dipped toward a pocket I think of as a listening throat. I clipped in and leaned my weight just enough to hear the reply. The left gate gave its hushed vowel. The right followed with a clipped answer. The pair shaped a syllable my ears had learned to want without my permission. I let them talk, and then I tested the anchor with my palm the way I have done for years. The paired vibration returned, familiar now, with that small waiting room between beats, the patient tick of something that counts without numbers. I set the torque wrench against the plate not to turn, only for the story that runs up the handle bone. It told me warmth and steadiness and a whisper, like breath through a reed. I wrote, plates reliable, phenomena persistent. Beyond the pocket, a ribbon of pale stone falls away toward the meadow. The view there takes even trained eyes and makes them tourists for a breath. The sun had slipped low enough to flatten relief and pump color into the little hut across the way. Laundry still hung, now unmoving, each shirt a still flag for a country that does not exist. The radio cleared its throat with that careful carrier hiss and then offered my own last report in compact form, shorn of the parts that make me sound human. I waited for the dispatcher to paste on an ending. The channel obliged with a word I did not use. Proceed. I looked at the handset as if it could explain itself, and then I told the book that the repeater might be borrowing fragments from old traffic. The route here threads between twin plates set so close they seem to share a single thought. I thumbed through their tags and found the same odd handwriting masquerading as mine. The family name squared off, the remark not quite a remark. On this one the ink held tidy, but the letters seemed to lean a hair against the grain, as if a patient hand had followed a template under the paper and the template had shifted. I photographed it, slow, then slower, so my own shadow did not paint over the evidence. In the screen I saw my outline stagger a breath behind my arm. I tried again. The outline obliged with a truer ride, and still the cable gave me a low, patient note as if to say enough. I told the radio I would extend the observation window through the next span and decide about sign-off at the last shoulder. The reply came with a subtle warmth I do not associate with electronics, a breath that inhabited the vowel of my own name and held it tenderly for a beat too long. I stared at the little speaker as if staring had ever fixed any interference. The hiss ebbed. I wrote, comms behavior human adjacent, likely environmental modulation, no actionable hazard observed. The longer span ahead is where the wall insists on honesty. The holds are good, but they ask for calm, and the cable runs with a little slack that teaches humility. I moved as I have been trained, and as my body has trained itself again, settling into a pace that feels honest and joins the day without fuss. At each contact, the notes formed the small phrase I had begun to hear as a trail, a set of cairns built of air. The temptation to change that pace to win a different answer rose and fell like hunger. I denied it because answers bought with tricks never last. Midway across the span, the light did the thing that makes tea smell phantom in the wind. The helmet foam warmed the top of my head. The gloves cooled. The left gate murmured. The right gate refused. Together they shaped a start of meaning. In the wall, I felt, not movement, but a suggestion that movement might be possible. I pressed more weight to see if encouragement could ask for too much. The notes held their patience. I eased back and they kept me company without complaint. I told that to the book in plain words and let the page serve as a relief valve for impatience. At a stance under a shallow brow, I found a second bridge. One I knew, but had not thought about as much as its siblings. The planks carried the calm, silvery look of wood that has been spared cruelty but not time. In the crease where saddle meets plank, tucked just out of the wind's appetite, lay another sliver of tag paper. This one had its corner dog-eared, as if someone with polite hands had hidden it and then thought better and tried not to. I could have fished it out with the torque wrench tip. I did not. The rule against removing found paper is there to prevent a small treasure hunt from becoming a damaged day. I wrote it down, the way we write down things that might require a conversation later, when soup and chairs give our hands someplace to go. The wall led into a crook where past freeze had opened a mouth that does not quite close in summer. That mouth does things to sound I do not care to explain. Inside it, the notes grew depth, not louder, not higher, simply nearer. The paired pulse through the plate aligned so perfectly with the tone that my body believed they were one thing. I spoke my family name very low for the log because I needed to know if the cable had become an instrument for a call I did not intend to answer. The response came shaped like an answer would come, but it withheld a final letter, as if language had learned restraint. I put my palm flat against the rock, felt the old stored sun, felt also the pretense of movement tucked in behind the warmth, and removed my hand as if I had touched a sleeping animal that had chosen to ignore me. I could have kept the pace and ended the loop inside daylight's grace. But the tags were heavy. The notes had braided themselves into a companion. The bridge corner with its paper sliver offered a question mark the size of a glove. Sign-off requires a clear list. My list had shifted between the bolts and the book, between what hardware insists upon and what metal will sometimes admit. I leaned my back to the wall and let the first larch line across the valley draw a clean edge through the air. My breath came steady and flattening. The radio chose that moment to give a soft, unbidden word. It did not belong to any human on our net. It belonged to the day and to the iron. It was the small, plain word that closes a report when there is nothing more to add. It said, noted. The professional part of me, the one with its boots tied by habit, felt a sting. It is my job to write that word, not the mountains, not the cables, not the winds. I told the radio, in a tone that would read neutral on any transcript, that observations were ongoing and that sign-off would wait until physical findings supported it. The reply carried only the breath of the channel and a hint of the vowel my left gate favors. Humility and stubbornness fought to a draw in my chest. I moved toward the last shoulder the route grants before the descent line splits away. The clips had fallen into an untroubled rhythm that made my body honest without requiring story. The sun hid itself behind a tooth of limestone and climbed out again a pace later. My shadow, which had wandered all afternoon, now minded its place with household obedience. That should have brought relief. It brought the opposite. Familiar suddenly looked like disguise. I took the next anchor with deliberate care, wrote the day's honest words on its tag, and tucked the tag under its sleeve with an attention that would have embarrassed me if anyone had been there to watch. At the shoulder, I could see the gully offering its long, safe slope into the meadow. The hut showed its little square of window, like a house in a children's drawing. I laid the book open across my thigh and read back through the notes I had made since the ladder at the start. The list had become a shape too slight to trace on a map and too persistent to treat as nothing. Tone in clips, echo in radio, foreign fiber near Lone Pine, sliver under bridge saddle, tag handwriting that wears my name without my hand, shadow that lags and catches up as if practicing, plates that breathe in pairs. None of these announced danger. All asked for more attention than daylight would provide. I sat with the pencil over the sign-off box and waited for my hand to make up my mind for me, the way it sometimes does when the question is paperwork rather than field. The pencil did nothing. The lanyards made a small, companionable contact with the cable, a sound so gentle I would have missed it if quiet had not become my only company. I closed the book and slid the pencil under the elastic. The blank sign-off sat there like a last step not yet taken. I did not take it. I told the dispatcher that I would keep to the high loop a little longer, to revisit a section near the listening post and confirm an observation, that descent would put me out past soup hour, and that there were no public hazards to speak of. The voice that returned was the clerk voice I know and trust, the one that holds daylight like a rule, and then after it, faint and careful, my own voice agreed with myself. I added a line to the book that I rarely write. Sign off deferred, further audit at dusk. The clips lay quiet as if pleased. The wall offered the cool of its brow. I turned back toward the notes. Dusk is an auditor with clean hands. It pinches color down to what the day can defend and sets every surface to a low disclosure. I turned back along the upper line with the book open at the blank sign-off, pencil under the elastic like a promise I had not yet earned. The pines began their slow black work on the ridges. Air moved with a steadier intention, not gusty, not slack, the kind of push that carries scent from the huts and secrets from the rock. My helmet foam cooled, as if someone had opened a window above my head. I clipped into the long traverse toward the listening post and let my breath take on the cadence that had tuned the notes earlier. Left gate settled, right followed. The pair offered their careful syllable and left a space afterward, as if waiting for a response I had not agreed to give. Night audit is more checklist than conversation. I said that aloud to fix it and then did exactly the opposite. I let the iron speak. At the first anchor past the shoulder, I set my palm on the plate and felt the twin pulse again, the small waiting room between beats intact, the barely there tick lodged like a restrained habit. The warmth at the rock face was gentler now, what the day leaves behind when it climbs out of sight. I set the torque wrench against the fastener not to move it, but to use the handle as a stethoscope for minerals. It gave a low, regular murmur up the bones, a story of stored heat and a hint of breathing that was not mine. I wrote, pulses persist, amplitude lower, source undetermined. The words looked like a person forced to speak through a cloth. The ledge that had held a goat bell earlier was empty of sound now. Even the insects had taken their choir elsewhere. The rope runs of the larch edge down in the meadow had lost their chrome and turned to proper tree. I moved with a patience that made my legs honest and my hands quiet. At the bridge just beyond the shallow brow, the sliver of tag paper still sat tucked under the saddle lip like a saved scrap. In the evening light, it looked darker at the edges, as if contact with metal had rubbed some silence into it. I probed the thought of easing it out with the wrench tip and set the thought aside. Remove, and the story moves out of reach. Leave, and the story may sharpen in place. The rule is dull and correct. It saves the living from the interesting. I paused halfway along the span to take a still with the field camera in the low interval mode that's kinder to batteries. On the screen, my own outline hung a shade behind my body for a breath and then gathered itself into me. The catch-up no longer startled so much as it instructed. When the outline hesitated, the left gate gave a low sigh and the right clipped off the tail. Together they shaped something that could have been the start of a name if I permitted it. I did not. I logged, cadence-linked cones continue at dusk. Shadow behavior repeats. Suspect angle artifact, no immediate hazard. Passing the corner where the wall holds its private weather, I drew in the smell of damp stone with the faint bitter of pine sap. That pairing always tells me the rock will ooze a little after full dark, even in fair conditions. The sleeve beneath the cable had taken a deeper shade where seeps like to scribble. I wiped my glove along the underside and came away with grit that knew neither the smell of rubber nor the grease of graphite. I pressed a fleck under tape in the book and told the tape to earn its keep overnight. The radio, which had learned discretion when company was near, gave a single soft vowel, like someone practicing courtesy over distance. I let it pass. At the listening post, I set myself into the cradle the rock offers and let the gates hang quiet. The fissure drank the last of the light, then chose a tone lower than any of the day to give back. It was softer than conversation, more like a night animal passing under a window. I took weight by degrees as I had earlier and felt the phrase return in careful steps, now with a new patience, as if the wall had chosen to lengthen its thought. I changed my timing on purpose, and the tone thinned and lost meaning. I returned to my ordinary pace, and it came back, thin thread to thin thread, knitting itself to my feet. For the record, I spoke my name in the same flat officer voice. The cable replied in 2 syllables that do not belong to language, but know how a name sits in air. I told the book I would not be clever with this. I had intended to reverse only a little way, and then drop to the gully for a simple descent into soup timing. The loop had other ideas. Past the listening post, the traverse looked familiar and yet felt longer by a breath each span, like a corridor whose painter had shifted the doorways half a hinge. I knew of no additional anchors between here and the little rib where someone's boot once shed a sole chip, and yet my hand found a plate that I did not remember, or that I had always known and had refused to count. Its tag wore a tidy resin sleeve with a bubble trapped exactly off-center, the same taut little bubble I had seen on the low bridge. The handwriting on the tag looked like mine in bad gloves. Remark line, a row of letters that could have been sensible if you believed in squinting as a method. I kept the pencil out of that box and left the ink to hold its own. At the rib I looked for the chip and found nothing. The rock, in the kindly way of stone at evening, presented only itself. That should have relieved me. It did not. In its place, Teeth had taken a small oval set as neatly as a place card. I set my finger beside it and felt only the fineness that means many boots have taught the same lesson here. The clips spoke in their softer register, and the radio gave a companionable throat clear that belonged to no one I knew. I told the radio to hold traffic a while. The radio held. The next anchor held a small nest of tags that I had thumbed earlier. I was not prepared for the topmost to be different. The resin sleeve was new to the eye, the print inside was not fresh to the sense, and the signature was my family name written with its honest slope and the little joining mark on the second letter that belongs to my hand alone. The date code matched the day, which is only to say it matched the season inside our notation. I stared hard at the tuck of paper against cord. My pencil stayed under the elastic where I had put it only a quarter of an hour ago or a week ago, or some other span that audit work knows how to stretch. I took a photograph. In the new light, my shadow did what shadows have always done, pretended to belong to me. I replaced the tag exactly as I had found it, and wrote in the book with a deliberate calm I have reserved for storms. Tag bearing my hand observed. Origin unknown. No removal. Flag for morning crew. Between that anchor and the bridge with the saved scrap, the traverse bent into a slow arc that never fails to ask you to leave something behind. I left nothing. I carried the quiet instead. The tones in the gates thinned to a line I could have snapped between two fingers if sound had mass. I spoke into the log about bridge saddle conditions, about sleeve scuffing, about the fine grit that is not the usual grit. Speaking turned the sounds back to obedient tools for a few breaths. Then a piece of the darkness lifted, not with light, but with attention. And I knew the loop had noticed that I had noticed it. I thought of the hut window and of soup whose warmth would undo my care in ways I did not want. I thought of the maintenance crew who would come with their cases and their measured patience and read my notes without translating them into confession. I thought of the simple rule that keeps both heroine and fool from pushing when the mountain has folded the day shut. I told the wall that I would be leaving my sign-off empty for now, and that I would bring a cleaner list in the morning. The wall let the last breeze pass through the fissure, used it to hum the final two-syllable shape it had been practicing, and then rested. On the way back toward the shoulder, I felt the paired pulse in the plates fade to a suggestion, like the touch of a moth against fabric. The grit on my glove settled into nothing. The resin sleeves went back to being sleeves. At the bridge, the tuck scrap held its corner with a dignity that did not ask for rescue. My own outline stopped rehearsing and resumed its duty as a silent follower. At the last anchor before the shoulder, I signed the tag in my usual neat print with a remark that could be read by anyone with a stake in this wall. Night audit performed. Route sound. Anomalies logged. Recommend secondary observation at dawn. The clip gates laid themselves in a hush against the cable. The radio agreed with a clean little breath that belonged to electronics again. From the shoulder, the gully presented as it always does at last light. A long, polite slope with careful stones and the occasional treacherous kindness. I told the dispatcher I was clearing the route and would file a deferral and report in the hut before dark chose to become night. The reply was ordinary and warmed by a voice I know. After the sign-off, something else repeated the words in my tone with one added gift, a gentle, approving hum that rode only the last letter. I let it go without chasing. The book lay open on my thigh with the sign-off box waiting like an understandable door. I closed the cover instead and told myself that an empty box can be honest. I began the descent with a professional insistence on thoughtless feet and deliberate hands. The tones in the clips thinned and then left. The wall kept its counsel. Below, the meadow took back its greenness from the ash of evening. Laundry turned to flags again, then to shapes, then to nothing. A dog asked a question and did not bother to wait for an answer. I followed the talus path, slow enough to remain mine. Behind me, above the shoulder, the cable gave a single breath through metal. It might have been a long-delayed echo of a move I had made. It might have been what iron says when it believes itself unobserved. I refused to choose between those and kept walking. Quiet exit is a choice you make before anyone else agrees. I told myself that, and then I told the wall in a tone made polite by tired legs. The gully kept its small tricks in the usual places. Stones that seemed friendly rolled their shoulders at the last moment. Gravel found ways to slide that felt personal. I kept my feet careful and my hands empty of anything but balance. The book rode in the chest pocket like a small animal that had learned to sleep standing. The radio offered no more than a housekeeping breath now and then, the reassurance of systems that have remembered their job. At the base of the talus, I stepped back into the larch shade and let the green hold me for a while. The smell there has its own calendar. Dust first, then pitch, then the cool that belongs to evening. I took water and felt the old click of enamel against a metal cap that always makes me think of classroom bells. The hut path cut across the meadow in its plain line. Laundry had come down. The yard showed only the long shape of a bench, and the silhouette of a broom leaned where hands can find it in the dark without looking. I called in, keeping my report spare, off route, no public hazards, deferral to morning, hut check-in next. The dispatcher answered with the voice I trust, and then something that was not a voice left a small, tidy sigh on the channel as the carrier fell away. It sounded like a page being turned. Inside the hut, the keeper had the calm patience that comes from living with weather. He laid a bowl on the table and asked after the loop, in the way people who manage risk ask questions, broad, neutral, leaving room for the professional to set boundaries. I offered the tidy version and felt my own sentences resist embroidery. Sound observations continue along the upper spans. Tags need a round of new sleeves before the next hard season. Mine are scuffing at a handful of sleeves to be monitored. He nodded at the parts that make sense. When I reached the part about the radio, dressing its replies in a mirror of my voice, he raised a thoughtful brow that did not presume anything. He said he had heard echoes in the cliffs that carry manner, not just tone, when weather sits a certain way. He refilled the bowl and let the subject find its own end. After soup, I stepped out with the book and leaned on the rail to write the day while the daylight still had shape. I kept to facts the way a witness under oath keeps to what they can swear to without looking away. Cable tone present on most spans when pace is natural and weight is honest. Tone thins or disappears when timing is forced. Tone most articulate at the listening post and the mouth in the corner. Paired pulses and anchor plates, persistent through afternoon and dusk. Foreign fibers at lone pine and under bridge saddle lip. Tag bearing my hand observed among known tags. Shadow behavior suggestive under certain angles. Comms behavior consistent with reflection and modulation, but with manner, present. I stopped and tasted the air for words I ought not add. The book remained respectful and quiet. I wrote the line I had promised the wall and myself. Sign off withheld, return at first light with secondary observer if available. The keeper set down a lantern on the rail without comment and went inside to his own chores. The meadow had gone to a dark that still remembers grass. The cliff above showed only its outline, a slow animal in sleep. From the yard came the small economies of a place closing for night, the clink of spoon against pot, the sweep of broom against stone, the scrape of chair legs accepting their lot. I kept my hand on the book and let the quiet in through the gloves. At the edge of hearing, where a noise becomes a choice, something moved along the idea of a tone. It never quite arrived, and yet I knew where to place my breath to hear it better. I did not. Back in the bunk room, I laid out the kit with the same order I use in morning, so that the next day cannot claim surprise. Harness slung, lanyards unknotted, helmet set, crown down to protect its padding, torquey wrench wiped and stored in its sleeve, camera plugged into the small outlet near the window that only wakes when you ask politely. I scrolled through a handful of frames to check that the day existed outside my head. Cable, glove, pale stone. In one still from the recess with its private weather, the edge of a tag lay tugged a hair farther from its sleeve than I had left it. In the next, it was tucked flush. The flicker could have been the simple delay of the interval combined with my own hand returning order without my awareness. I told the camera thank you for its impartial malice and set it face down so it would stop offering me those small legal truths. I slept the way field sleep happens, not deeply, but in a long, controlled fall through hours that refused to line up. Once, before full dark had hardened, I woke to the radio giving a soft consonant, a sound like the last letter of a word leaning against itself. I listened for company on the channel and heard only the static that belongs to rock mass and air. I turned the volume low and set the handset under my cap to teach it manners. When I slept again, I dreamed not of falling or of work undone, but of paper, tags fanned on a table, a pencil skating the remark line, the small satisfaction of a knot tied neatly through a resin sleeve. In the dream, a hand that felt like mine signed a name that was not quite mine and then turned the page. I woke with the taste of pencil on my tongue, the metallic ghost that graphite leaves for people who chew their tools. Before dawn, the hut keeper's stove gave a sound as recognizable as a family voice. I rose and set the kit in motion. The book went into the chest pocket, the pencil returned to its berth. The camera stowed itself with the passivity of an obedient animal. At the door, the keeper handed me bread and a look that asked nothing more than I was willing to give. I said I would bring the morning clean, and he said the mountain likes a second opinion. On the path, dew had come down just enough to claim the toes of boots. The meadow kept its promise of scent. The cliff felt nearer than it had in evening, and that closeness was neither welcome nor unwelcome. It was simply what the day required. At the base of the first ladder, I paused to write the lines that make the morning official. Weather fair, wind light, intent to repeat upper span observations. No public en route at this hour. Communications nominal. I clipped in, and the left gate, which had learned a syllable out of me yesterday, offered only a compact breath and went quiet. The right gate kept its own counsel. I climbed the first run slow enough to let muscle remember, and quick enough to avoid making reverence out of routine. At the first stance, hand to plate, the anchor gave me warmth, caught from night rather than day. The paired pulse that had become familiar was present and then absent, like someone standing behind a door you know well and choosing not to knock. I moved toward the listening post with the practiced patience that keeps legs from making theater. Along the way, the bridge saddles held their corners tidy. The foreign fiber under the lip remained, or its idea did. The lone pine on the high run still wore its stubborn posture. My shadow kept time without mischief in the early angle. The notes in the gates felt thinner, as if the instrument had gone out of tune while I slept. Near the recess with its private weather, I put my palm on a plate that had been warm yesterday and found it shy. The tick between the paired pulses, the one that lodged like a habit, gave me a single polite tap, and then would not repeat for love or science. I wrote, "Phenomena reduced at dawn. Continue monitoring. Second opinion still warranted." At the listening post, I set into the cradle again and waited with no weight in the system. Nothing sang. I added weight in the measured way that had teased the phrase out at the day before. The cable gave me only the expected breath of steel accepting a task. I said my family name in a low tone fit for the log. The wall offered field silence, which is a richer thing than absence. For one breath, I felt the refusal as a kind of courtesy, the way a competent colleague declines an invitation that would compromise both of you. For the next breath, I wanted the notes back. And that want revealed more about me than about any instrument built by rock and time. I stood there long enough to make the keeper wonder if soup would be early or late. And then, because work belongs to schedules as much as to mysteries, I turned back down the line. At each anchor, I checked the tags with the same neatness I demand from my worst self. The odd handwriting persisted where it had been before, and in daylight it looked more like a cousin than an imposter. At one plate I found a fresh sleeve nicked by a boot edge, a simple, honest scar I could file like a small victory. The radio behaved like a radio. The larches shook off whatever quiet oath they had spoken in the night and resumed being trees. Back at the base plate, I opened the book to the sign-off box and let the pencil wait above it until my hand found its own truth. We close loops, not because they are solved, but because people will use them. I wrote the sentences that hold both caution and permission. Route inspected, hardware sound, tags require attention within a respectable window, recommend posted note about pace and spacing on upper traverse for those who read such things. Anomalies observed and logged. Further study appropriate but not urgent. In the box where a single word often lives, I wrote a phrase that means as little as it needs to and as much as we can allow. Open with care. I called the dispatcher and gave the version that belongs on record. The voice at the far end answered with professional ease. After the exchange, the channel held its breath in a way that would mean nothing to anyone else and a great deal to me. The left gate, whose manners had improved, made one low sound that I felt more than heard, a punctuation as small and final as a period on a tag. I unclipped, shouldered the harness, and let the first larch line carry my eyes back to ordinary distance. The meadow wore its green again. The hut rail would be warm soon. The cliff settled into the background like a large animal who has decided to nap where you can see it. On the walk back, I kept the book shut so the day would not try to add anything it had not earned. In the yard, the broom leaned in its place and did not suggest any story about itself. The keeper poured coffee into a cup with a hairline crack that has never grown. We spoke in the casual way of people who share risk without owning it. When I set the book on the table, the pencil slipped and tapped the cover with a rhythm that matched the paired pulse I had felt in the plates. I picked it up and laid it down again on purpose. The pencil refused to repeat the trick. We drank the coffee. When I stepped outside, the radio on my shoulder gave one brief carrier breath, then turned humble. From the ridge, very faint, came what could have been a goat bell through tree and stone, or a clip gate settling against steel, or the sound iron makes when it has decided to keep a thing for itself. I did not stand there to parse it. I walked into the generous business of the day with the sign-off written, the loop open, and the small notes folded where they belong.